The chamber was older than most stars, and it smelled like cold metal and fear. 4,000 species had seats in the Galactic Council, but on this day only the 12 eldest mattered, and they sat in a half-circle of black stone, high above the rest like gods deciding the fate of ants. Archon Sethal of the Dreamari was the oldest among them, and his scales were the color of deep space, and his eyes burned like dying suns. And when he spoke, the entire chamber went silent, because no one had heard him speak in over 300 years. "We will now vote on Resolution 7 Omega," he said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room like a blade sliding across stone. The total biological erasure of the species known as humanity. A murmur swept through the chamber, and thousands of alien diplomats shifted in their seats, and some looked horrified, and some looked relieved, and most looked like they had already made up their minds a long time ago. The evidence had been presented over the course of 6 days, and it was damning in a way that no species had ever been damned before. The Council's oldest prediction engines had modeled humanity's trajectory, and the results had terrified even the machines that calculated them, and the number was simple and brutal, and it read like a death sentence for the rest of the galaxy. 99.97% probability that within 10,000 years, humans would either consume or subjugate every other intelligent species in existence. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, because they were none of those things, and in fact by galactic standards, they were barely out of their cradle, having only discovered interstellar travel 300 years ago. No, the danger was something else, and the analysts had struggled to even name it because no species in the history of the galaxy had ever displayed it to this degree. Humans adapted, and they did it faster than anything the galaxy had ever seen. They landed on frozen worlds and built cities within a single generation, and they crashed on hostile planets and befriended the predators that tried to eat them, and they encountered AI systems designed to destroy organic life, and somehow talked those systems into becoming allies, and they met species that hated them. And within 50 years, those species were trading with them and laughing at their jokes and wearing their clothes. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense, and that was what made them so terrifying, because conquerors could be fought, but humans did not fight to win territory or resources, and they fought to connect, and once they connected with something, they never let go. The Velathi ambassador rose from her seat, and her insectoid body clicked and hummed with distress, and she had traded with humans for 200 years. And she loved them in the way that a merchant loves their best customer, which is to say completely and without shame. "This is madness," she said, and her translator turned her clicks into words that rang across the chamber. "You cannot erase an entire species, because your machines say they might be dangerous someday, and every species might be dangerous someday, and that is what it means to be alive." But the chamber was already decided, and the vote was a formality. The Gren philosopher, a massive fungal being that communicated through spore clouds, released a pattern that the translators rendered as deep sorrow, and he said, "We will regret this, and we will regret it for longer than we can imagine." The vote passed, and it was not even close. Within 6 hours, the Purge fleet launched from 12 different staging points across the galaxy, and it was the largest military operation in 100,000 years, and it was aimed at a species that had no idea it was coming. The ships were not ordinary warships, and they carried weapons that most species did not even know existed, and biodissolvers that could break down human DNA at the molecular level, and neural scrubbers that could erase every trace of human thought from any system that had ever interacted with one, and planet killers that could crack a world like an egg. Earth was the first target. It happened at 3 in the morning Greenwich Mean Time, and the sky turned white, and then the oceans boiled, and then there was nothing, and the whole thing took 11 minutes, and 8 billion people died without ever knowing why. The colonies fell next one by one like candles being snuffed out in Proxima Colony and Kepler Station, and the Mars settlements and the deep space outposts, and the generation ships crawling between stars and all of them gone, and all of them silent, and all of them erased as if they had never existed at all. 11.4 billion humans had lived in the galaxy when the purge began, and 72 hours later the number was 0. Or so the report said. Archon Sethal sat in his private chamber aboard the command station, and he reviewed the final erasure report, and every line read the same thing, confirmed 0, and he should have felt relief, because this was what he had wanted, and this was what he had argued for, and this was what he had voted for. But he did not feel relief, and instead he felt something he had not felt in 10,000 years, and it took him a moment to recognize it because it had been so long. It was guilt. He pushed the feeling aside and scrolled to the end of the report, and then he stopped. Every line read confirmed 0 except one. One biosignature remained, and it was on a remote uninhabited moon in the Cathara expanse, and the moon had no name and no strategic value, and no reason for anyone to be there, and yet the scanners were clear. One human alive, and the biosignature was small, and the readings suggested a child approximately 9 years old. Sethal stared at the report for a long time, and then he called his lieutenant and said, "Send a strike team and finish it." The strike team was made up of 12 Dreamari hunters, and they were the best soldiers in the galaxy, and each one had killed more enemies than most species had members, and they took a fast ship, and they arrived at the moon within 4 hours. They landed, and they entered the small research shelter half buried in gray dust, and they found the boy. What happened next was never officially recorded. The strike team returned to the command station 9 hours later, and their ship was damaged in ways that made no sense, and the weapons were fused to their housings, as if they had been melted, and then frozen, and the armor on every soldier was cracked from the inside out, as if something had pressed against it gently, but with the force of a collapsing star. None of them would speak, and the team leader, a veteran of 600 years of combat, sat in the debriefing room and stared at the wall, and when Sethal demanded a report, the leader said only one thing. "The boy is still alive, and you cannot kill him, and I will not go back." Sethal felt that guilt again, and this time it was mixed with something worse. It was fear. He pulled up the biosignature scan one more time and zoomed in on the moon, and on the tiny dot of life sitting alone in a shelter on a world with no air and no warmth, and no one left to care about him. A 9-year-old boy and the last human in the universe, and somehow the most dangerous thing the Galactic Council had ever encountered. Sethal closed the report and sat in silence for a very long time. Somewhere on that dead moon, a boy named Kale sat in the dark and held his knees to his chest, and whispered for his mother, and something warm and invisible wrapped around him like arms, and held him close, and the air shimmered with a light that had no source. And Kale closed his eyes and felt safe, even though he was the last of his kind, and even though the galaxy wanted him dead, and even though he was only 9 years old and completely alone. He was not alone, and he would never be alone again. He just did not know it yet. Kale woke up the same way he had woken up every morning for the past 31 days, and that was with the feeling that something was wrong, and that the wrongness would never go away. The shelter was small, and it had been built by his parents for their research work, and it had 2 rooms and a food printer and an air recycler, and enough supplies to last one adult about 6 months, which meant it could last a small boy quite a bit longer. He sat up on the cot and rubbed his eyes and looked at the empty cot across from him, where his mother used to sleep, and the emptiness hit him the way it always did, which was like a fist inside his chest that squeezed and would not let go. He did not cry because he had cried so much in the first week that his body seemed to have decided it was done with crying for a while, and instead he just sat there and breathed and waited for the squeezing to stop. It never fully stopped, but it got small enough to carry. Kale was 9 years old and he understood some things about what had happened, and he did not understand others, and the things he understood were worse than the things he did not. He understood that his parents were dead, and he understood that the sky had turned red, and he understood that the comlinks had gone silent, and he understood that no one was coming for him. What he did not understand was why. And what he did not understand even more was why he was still alive, because he remembered the fire, and he remembered the red sky, and he remembered the shelter shaking so hard that the walls cracked, and he remembered thinking that he was going to die. And then something had wrapped around him. It was warm and it was gentle, and it was like being held by something so big that he could not see the edges of it, and the fire had come through the walls, and it had touched everything except him, and the air had been sucked out of the room, and he should have suffocated, but he did not, and the ground had cracked beneath the shelter, and he should have fallen, but he did not. And when it was over, he was sitting in the middle of a ruined room completely untouched, and the walls were burned, and the equipment was melted, and everything his parents had built was destroyed, except for the food printer, and the air recycler, and the cot, and him. Kale had tried to make sense of it, and he could not, and so he did what children do when the world stops making sense, and he made a friend. He called it Luma. Luma was not visible most of the time, but Kale could feel it the way you can feel sunlight on your skin, even with your eyes closed, and it was always there, and it was always warm, and when Kale was scared it got warmer, and when Kale was sad the air around him shimmered like heat rising off summer pavement. Sometimes Luma moved things, and the first time it happened Kale had been trying to reach a food packet on a high shelf, and he was too short and he stretched and stretched, and then the packet floated down to him gently, as if an invisible hand had picked it up and placed it in his palm. He had stared at the packet for a long time, and then he had said, "Thank you, Luma," and the air shimmered. After that it happened more often, and Luma would open doors for him, and Luma would fix the recycler when it made strange noises. And once when Kale tripped and fell, Luma caught him before he hit the ground, and held him in the air for a moment like a parent catching a toddler, and then set him down softly. Kale talked to Luma constantly, because there was no one else to talk to, and he told Luma about his mother, and how she used to sing to him, and he told Luma about his father, and how he used to carry Kale on his shoulders, and he told Luma about Earth, which he had never seen, but which his mother had described to him so many times that he felt like he had. There were oceans, he said one night while lying on his cot and staring at the ceiling, and they were so big you could not see the other side, and the water was blue and sometimes green, and there were animals in it that were bigger than this whole shelter. The air shimmered and Kale smiled, and it was the first time he had smiled in 31 days. On the 32nd day the ships came. Kale saw them through the shelter window, and they were not like any ships he had seen before, and they were black and sharp, and they moved like predators, and there were 12 of them, and they landed in a circle around the shelter. He was afraid, and Luma responded to his fear immediately, and the temperature in the room rose, and the air hummed, and Kale could feel something building around him like a wall made of warmth. The soldiers came through the door, and they were tall and scaled, and their eyes glowed red, and they carried weapons that pulsed with energy, and the leader pointed one at Kale, and said something in a language Kale did not understand. Kale stood there shaking, and he looked up at the soldier, and he said, "Please do not hurt me." And then Luma moved. It was not violent, and it was not loud, and there was no explosion and no flash of light, and instead it was like the whole moon took a breath and then exhaled, and every weapon in the room stopped working at the same time, and the energy cells went dark and the triggers locked, and the targeting systems displayed nothing but static. The soldiers tried to fire, and nothing happened, and they tried again, and nothing happened, and the leader grabbed Kale by the arm, and Luma responded to that, and the leader was pushed backward so gently that it almost looked like he had chosen to step away, except that he slid across the floor and through the wall and out of the shelter, and across 50 meters of gray dust before he stopped. None of them were hurt, and that was the strangest part because Luma could clearly destroy them, and instead it simply made them stop. The soldiers retreated to their ships and tried to take off, and the engines would not start, and they sat there for 5 hours. And then the engines started on their own, as if Luma had decided they had waited long enough, and they left. Kale sat on the floor of the shelter and hugged his knees and said, "Thank you, Luma," and the air shimmered. On the 40th day, the bombardment came, and Kale watched from the window as missiles streaked down from orbit, and he was terrified, and he pressed his hands against the glass and closed his eyes and waited to die. The missiles detonated in the upper atmosphere, and every single one of them, and the energy did not dissipate, but instead gathered into a single point of light that hung in the sky for a moment like a new star, and then drifted away into space harmlessly. Kale opened his eyes and looked up, and the sky was clear. On the 53rd day, they sent something worse, and Kale did not see it, but he felt it, and it was cold, and it was wrong, and it felt like the opposite of Luma, and it tried to take apart the air around him molecule by molecule. Luma fought it, and for the first time Kale felt Luma strain, and the warmth flickered, and the shimmer dimmed, and Kale grabbed at the air as if he could hold onto his friend, and he shouted, "Do not go away, please do not go away, I cannot do this alone." And Luma surged, and the cold thing folded in on itself and vanished, and Luma wrapped around Kale so tightly that the boy gasped, and then laughed because it felt like the best hug he had ever received. Far away on Axiom Prime, Archon Sethal received the reports, and each one was worse than the last, and each one told the same story, which was that the boy could not be killed, and whatever was protecting him was beyond anything the Council had ever encountered. Sethal went to the deep archive because there was nowhere else to go, and he searched the oldest records and the records before the records and the memories that predated memory itself. And when he found what he was looking for, he sat in the dark for a very long time, and his hands shook, and his ancient heart beat so fast he thought it might stop, because he finally understood what was protecting the boy. And it was so much worse than he had imagined. On the dead moon, Kale lay on his cot, and Luma drew shapes in the dust on the floor, and it drew stars, and it drew animals, and then it drew a face, and the face had kind eyes, and a soft smile, and Kale recognized it immediately. "Mama," he whispered. And he smiled and he cried at the same time, and Luma held him until he fell asleep, and the moon was quiet, and the stars turned overhead, and the last human in the universe dreamed of oceans he had never seen. The deep archive was not a library in any normal sense of the word, and it was not a building or a database or a collection of books, and instead it was a wound in the fabric of space itself, where memories had been pressed into the walls of reality like fossils pressed into stone. Archon Sethal walked through it alone because no one else was allowed, and his footsteps echoed in corridors that should not have had echoes because sound does not travel in the spaces between dimensions. But the archive had its own rules and its own physics, and its own way of reminding visitors that they were very small and very temporary. He had come here 3 times in his life, and each time he had learned something that changed the galaxy, and each time he had wished he had not learned it. This time would be no different. The records he found were not written in any language because they predated language, and they predated thought, and they predated the very concept of information. And instead they were impressions burned into the structure of the archive by beings so old that calling them ancient was like calling the ocean damp. The architects. Every species in the galaxy knew the name, and no species in the galaxy knew the truth, and the official histories said that the architects were the first intelligent beings to arise in the universe, and that they had shaped the galaxy and seeded it with the building blocks of life, and then vanished. The official histories were wrong. The architects had not vanished, and instead they had transcended, and they had become something that existed beyond matter and energy and time, and they had shed their physical forms the way a snake sheds its skin, and they had stepped into dimensions that the younger species could not even perceive, let alone comprehend. But before they left, they had done one final thing. They had looked at the galaxy they had built, and they had loved it the way a parent loves a child, and they had worried about it the way a parent worries about a child left alone, and they had asked themselves a question. What is the most important thing in the universe? And the answer they had arrived at was not strength, and it was not intelligence, and it was not technology, and it was not the ability to conquer or destroy or dominate. The answer was potential. The capacity to grow and to change, and to reach for something greater and to fail and to get back up, and to love the universe so fiercely that the universe had no choice but to love you back. And they knew that potential was fragile, and they knew that the galaxy was full of species that feared what they did not understand, and they knew that the brightest lights were always the ones that others tried hardest to extinguish. So they built a guardian. They poured everything they had into it, and every ounce of their transcendent power, and every particle of their cosmic knowledge, and every fragment of the love they felt for the galaxy they were leaving behind, and they compressed it all into a single point of living energy, and they gave it one purpose. Find the being with the greatest potential and protect it, and never stop protecting it, no matter what. They called it the first light because it was the last thing they created, and the first thing they wanted the galaxy to see when it was ready. And then they left, and the first light drifted, and it searched, and it waited, and it sank beneath the surface of a barren moon in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, and it slept for 4 billion years. Until a human woman named Dr. Lena Vasic dug too deep and woke it up. Sethal read this, and his blood, which was cold to begin with, went colder, and he understood now why Lena Vasic had been on that moon, because she had detected the energy signature of the ancient structure buried beneath the surface, and she had thought it was a simple artifact, and she had brought her husband and her son, and she had started digging. And when she activated the structure, the first light had opened its eyes for the first time in 4 billion years, and it had scanned the galaxy in an instant, and it had evaluated every living being on every world in every system. And it had chosen a 9-year-old boy named Kale. Not because Kale was the strongest human or the smartest human or the most important human, by any measure that the galaxy would recognize. And in fact, by most measures, he was completely unremarkable, and he was small for his age, and he was shy, and he liked to draw pictures of animals, and he talked to bugs, and he cried when he saw something beautiful. The first light chose him because of what it found inside his mind, and what it found was something that the architects had valued above all other qualities. Unconditional wonder. Kale feared nothing because he had not yet learned to fear, and he loved everything because he had not yet learned to hate, and he looked at the universe with eyes that saw only beauty even in the dark, and even in the cold, and even in the empty spaces between stars. And when the purge came and the fire fell from the sky, the first light wrapped around Kale, and it said in a language older than words, "This one is mine, and you will not touch him, and I will stand between him and the end of everything if I must." Sethal sat in the archive and stared at the wall for 6 hours. Then he went back to the council. The emergency session was chaos from the moment it began, and Sethal stood before the conclave and told them what he had found, and the reactions ranged from disbelief to terror to something that looked very much like despair. "You are telling us," said the Dreamari second elder, and his voice was shaking, "that the guardian built by the architects themselves has chosen a human child as the most important being in the galaxy." "That is what I am telling you," Sethal said. "And that by attempting to erase humanity, we have made ourselves the enemy of a force that predates our species by 4 billion years. Yes." The chamber erupted, and species that had not spoken in centuries were shouting, and species that communicated through light were flashing so brightly that the translators could not keep up, and somewhere in the back, a Gren philosopher released a spore cloud so dense that everyone within 50 meters started weeping uncontrollably. The Velathi ambassador Chiton speaker Cora rose from her seat, and she was small compared to most of the beings in the room, but her voice carried, because she was angrier than anyone had ever seen a Velathi get, and the Velathi were known for being calm to the point of seeming dead. "You destroyed 11 billion people," she said, and her clicks were sharp and fast like gunfire. "You burned their worlds and erased their children and dissolved their history. And you did it because your precious machines told you they were dangerous. And now the oldest force in the universe has looked at what you did, and it has chosen the last surviving human as the thing it will protect above all else." She paused and looked around the chamber. "Do you understand what that means?" she said. "It means the architects themselves have judged you and they have found you guilty. And the punishment is not death, because the first light does not kill. And instead the punishment is something far worse, and the punishment is knowledge, and you will spend the rest of your existence knowing that you destroyed the species the universe loved the most." The chamber was silent. Sethal felt the guilt again, and this time it was so heavy that he could barely stand, and he thought about the boy on the moon, and the boy who was 9 years old and who had done nothing wrong, and who had lost everything, and who was being held by a force of cosmic love that had waited 4 billion years just to find him. And he thought about the 11 billion humans who would never come back, and the songs they would never sing, and the worlds they would never build, and the connections they would never make. And for the first time in 10,000 years, Archon Sethal of the Dreamari, the oldest living being in the Galactic Council, the architect of resolution, 7 Omega, felt a tear run down his scaled face. It burned like acid because Dreamari tears always did. Far away on a dead moon, Kale sat on the surface, in a thin environmental suit that Luma kept pressurized and warm, and he looked up at the stars, and Luma made shapes in the dust beside him. Stars and animals and faces. And Kale pointed at the stars and said, "Luma, which ones did we live on?" And Luma made the dust rise and form a map, and dozens of tiny lights glowed, and Kale looked at them and said, "That is a lot of homes." And then he was quiet for a while, and he said, "Do you think they remember us out there?" The dust shimmered and formed a shape that might have been a heart, or might have been a star, and Kale nodded as if he understood. "I will remember for them," he said. "I will remember all of it." And the first light, who had waited 4 billion years, and who had been built by gods, and who could move stars if it needed to, wrapped around one small boy, and hummed a sound that was older than the galaxy. And it sounded like a lullaby. 6 months after the purge, the galaxy had not forgotten the boy on the moon, and in fact the galaxy could think of nothing else. On 100,000 worlds the story spread through whispers and encrypted channels and forbidden broadcasts, and it was the story of a species erased, and a child who survived, and a light that would not let him die, and it made some species angry, and it made some species sad, and it made the conclave of elders absolutely terrified. Because a terrified government does not think clearly, and a government that does not think clearly does desperate things. Archon Sethal had not slept in 11 days, and his scales had turned from the color of deep space to a dull gray, and his eyes, which once burned like dying suns, now flickered like candles in wind, and the guilt was eating him alive, but the fear was eating him faster. Because the first light was not just protecting the boy, and it was growing. The energy readings from Cathara Roman 7 had tripled every month since the purge, and the scientists could not explain it, and the military advisors could not contain it, and the conclave could not ignore it, and the question that haunted every meeting and every report and every sleepless night was simple. What happens when it stops growing and starts doing something else? So Sethal made a decision that would be remembered as the greatest act of desperation in galactic history, and he ordered the deployment of the Void K. The void cage was not a weapon in the traditional sense, and it was a pocket dimension generator capable of folding a section of reality into itself and sealing it shut, and it had been used exactly once before to trap a rogue AI that had consumed an entire star system, and it had taken the combined resources of 600 worlds to build it, and it had nearly destroyed the species that activated it. But it had worked, and Sethal believed it would work again because the first light was powerful, yes, but it was still energy, and energy could be contained, and dimensions could be folded and sealed, and a boy and his guardian could be locked away forever in a space outside of space where they would exist but never again interact with the galaxy. The fleet assembled in the Cathara system, and it was the largest military force deployed in 100,000 years, and there were 9,000 warships and 1,200 support vessels and 3 mobile space stations, and the void cage itself, which was carried in the belly of a ship so large that it had its own gravitational field. Kale saw them coming. He was sitting on the surface of the moon in his environment suit, and Luma kept him warm and kept him breathing, and he watched the ships fill the sky like a swarm of dark insects, blocking out the stars one by one. He was not afraid the way he had been before, and something had changed in the 6 months since the purge, and the change was that he had found his mother's log. It had been buried in the damaged computer system in the shelter, and Luma had helped him recover it, and it was a video recording made in the last minutes before the fire came, and his mother's face was on the screen, and she was crying, but her voice was steady. "They are killing us, Kale," she had said, "all of us, and I do not know why, but I think it is because they are afraid of what we could be, and I need you to listen to me, and I need you to remember this." She had leaned closer to the camera, and her eyes were fierce and full of love. "Do not let them make you afraid too, and whatever happens you be better, and you be so much better than they are, and not because you are stronger, but because you choose to be kind when they choose to be cruel." Kale had watched the recording 412 times. And now he stood on the surface of a dead moon and watched 9,000 warships arrange themselves in a sphere around him, and he was not afraid. And he was not angry either, or at least he had not been angry until this moment. But something shifted as he watched the fleet take position, and the shift was small at first, like a crack in ice that starts as a whisper and then spreads, and then the whole lake breaks apart. They killed his mother, and they killed his father, and they killed his neighbors and his teachers and his friends, and every human who had ever lived on every world that humanity had ever touched. And they killed the people who sang, and the people who painted, and the people who reached out their hands to strangers, and the people who built and dreamed and loved. And now they had come to kill him too. And they would not stop. Kale felt something he had never felt before, and it was not rage, because rage was hot and this was not hot, and it was not cold either, and it was something deeper and older, and it came from a place inside him that he did not know existed. And if he had been old enough to name it, he would have called it grief with teeth. The void cage activated. The sky split open and reality folded like paper, and a hole appeared in the universe above Kale's head, and it was black and it was hungry and it pulled at everything around it. And the dust on the moon's surface lifted into the air, and the rocks cracked, and the shelter behind him groaned and began to tear apart. And Kale looked up at it and said, "No." And Luma responded. For 6 months the first light had been gentle, and it had been a shield and a blanket and a pair of invisible arms that held a boy when he cried, and it had deflected missiles and disabled soldiers and absorbed bombs, and it had done all of this softly and carefully, and without violence. But Kale was not just sad anymore. He was grieving with purpose, and the purpose was to survive. And the purpose was to honor 11 billion people who could not survive. And the purpose was to be better the way his mother told him to be. And being better did not mean being weak. And being better meant standing up when the whole universe was trying to push you down. The first light unfolded. It was the only word that fit, because what happened was not an explosion. And it was not an attack, and it was an unfolding like a flower opening, except the flower was made of light older than stars, and it was the size of a moon. Cathara Roman 7 cracked open, and light poured out of the fractures, and it was warm and golden, and it rose in a column that stretched from the moon's surface to the edge of the system, and every sensor on every ship, on every station, on every planet in the galaxy detected it at the same time. The void cage did not just fail, and it was unmade, and the pocket dimension collapsed in on itself, and the reality fold smoothed out, and the black hole above Kale's head closed like an eye and was gone. And then the first light turned its attention to the fleet. The weapons dissolved, and they did not explode, and they did not break, and they simply came apart at the atomic level, and the energy that held them together was released gently like breath and scattered across space as starlight. And the warships were not destroyed because nothing was destroyed, and instead their weapons and their shields and their engines were all returned to raw energy and distributed across the void as harmless light. 9,000 warships sat powerless and drifting and dark, and not a single being on any of them was hurt. And Kale stood on the surface of a shattered moon, surrounded by light that poured out of the ground beneath him, and the light moved around him like a living thing. And it was beautiful, and it was terrifying, and it was the most powerful thing the galaxy had ever witnessed. And at the center of it was a small boy with tears on his face. And then he spoke. The first light carried his voice, and it did not just broadcast it to the fleet, and it carried it to every ship and every station and every council chamber and every home on every world in the galaxy, and 4,000 species heard a boy's voice at the same time. My name is Kale Vasic, and I am 9 years old, and I am the last human. His voice was shaking, but it did not stop. You killed my mom, and you killed my dad, and you killed everyone. And I know what you did, and I know why you did it, and you were afraid of us because you thought we would take everything from you. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But that is not what we were, and that is not what I am, and I am not going to hurt you because my mom told me to be better, and she was smarter than all of you, and I am going to listen to her. He looked up at the sky full of dead ships and drifting light. But I need you to hear me, and I need you to hear me right now. And if you come for me again, you will not be fighting a boy, and you will be fighting everything humanity ever was, and every song we ever sang, and every picture we ever painted, and every hand we ever reached out, and every single one of us, all 11 billion, and you could not beat us when we were alive, and you will not beat us now. The galaxy was silent. In the council chamber on Axiom Prime 4,000 species sat motionless, and some were weeping, and some were trembling, and some were staring at nothing. And the Velathi ambassador chitin speaker Cora stood at her seat with her forelimbs clasped together, and tears running down her chitinous face. Archon Sethal sat in his chair, and he looked at his hands were shaking, and he thought about what he had done, and he thought about 11 billion people, and he thought about a boy standing alone on a broken moon, telling the galaxy he would not hurt them even though he could. And something inside Sethal that had been holding together for 10,000 years finally broke. He lowered his head, and he did not speak, and he did not move, and the chamber was silent around him, and the silence was the loudest thing the galaxy had ever heard. On the shattered moon, Kale sat down in the dust, and the light slowly folded back into the ground, and Luma wrapped around him warm and gentle, and the boy who had just spoken to 4,000 species put his head on his knees and cried the way only a child can cry, which is completely and without shame. And the stars watched, and they said nothing because there was nothing left to say. 1 year after the purge, the galaxy was a different place, and the difference was not in the stars or the planets or trade routes, but in the silence that hung over everything like smoke after a fire. The conclave of elders was dissolved, and it happened quietly and without ceremony because there was no ceremony grand enough to mark the end of an institution that had governed the galaxy for 9 million years, and the 12 eldest species surrendered their authority and stepped back into the shadows they had come from, and most of them did it with relief, because the weight of what they had done was too heavy to carry while sitting on a throne. Archon Sethal was exiled, and the exile was his own request because no one on the council had the courage to sentence him, and he walked out of the chamber on Axiom Prime without looking back, and he boarded a small ship and he flew to the edge of the galaxy, and he was never seen again. Some said he went looking for forgiveness, and some said he went looking for death, and some said he went looking for the place where human souls go, and that he intended to stand there and apologize to each one individually, and that it would take him the rest of eternity, which was exactly what he deserved. A new governing body formed in the conclave's place, and it was smaller and humbler, and it was led by species that had opposed the purge, and the Velathi ambassador Khitan speaker Cora was elected as its first speaker, and she accepted the role with a click that the translators rendered as, "I will try not to destroy any civilizations while I am in charge." No one laughed because it was not a joke. And at the center of all of this change was a boy who was brought to Axiom Prime not as a prisoner and not as a weapon, and not as a symbol, but as a guest. Kale walked through the halls of the greatest station in the galaxy, and he was small, and the halls were built for beings the size of mountains, and everything was too big, and too bright, and too loud. And he held Luma close the way a child holds a blanket, and the shimmer around him was constant now and visible to anyone who looked. The species of the galaxy did not know what to make of him. Some feared him because of what protected him, and they kept their distance, and watched from far away, and whispered to each other about the boy who could not be killed, and the light that could unmake fleets. But others were curious, and the curious ones came closer, and the Velathi larvae were the first because Velathi larvae are afraid of nothing, and they swarmed around Kale, clicking and buzzing and climbing on his shoulders, and pulling his hair, and Kale laughed, and it was the first time he had laughed in a year, and the sound of it echoed through the station like music. The Gren philosopher, whose name was untranslatable, but who Kale called Old Moss, spent hours talking with the boy, and Old Moss communicated through spore clouds, and Kale could not understand the spores, but Luma translated them into patterns of warmth and cold on Kale's skin. And so they talked, and they talked about everything, and nothing, the way a grandfather and a grandson talk when they have all the time in the world. Old Moss asked Kale what humans were like, and Kale said they were loud, and they were messy, and they argued about everything, and they loved too hard, and they forgave too easily, and they could not stop reaching for things that were too far away. Old Moss released a spore cloud that the translators rendered as, "That sounds exhausting." Kale smiled and said, "It was, and I miss it every day." The months passed, and Kale grew, and he was still small, but he was less fragile, and the grief did not go away. But it changed shape the way grief does when you carry it long enough, and it stopped being a fist in his chest, and it became something more like a room inside him where he kept everything he had lost, and he visited the room often, but he did not live there. But there was a sadness that would not change shape, and it was the knowledge that he was the last, and that every human song existed only in his memory, and every human face existed only in his dreams, and he was 9 years old when the purge happened, and he was 10 now, and he could not remember everything, and every day he forgot a little more, and it was like watching his species die a second time, one memory at a time. He told Luma about this, and he said, "I cannot hold all of them, and there were so many, and I am only one, and I am small, and I am losing them." And Luma responded in a way it had never responded before. The shimmer around Kale brightened, and it was not the defensive brightness that came when danger was near, and it was something else, and it was warm and deliberate, and it pulsed in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. And then Kale saw something. It was not with his eyes, and it was not with his ears, and it was somewhere deeper than that. And it was like a door opening inside his mind, and behind the door was a light so vast that he could not see the edges. And in the light there were faces. Billions of them. 11 billion faces, and they were clear and perfect, and each one was distinct, and each one was alive in the way that memories are alive when they are held by something that never forgets. His mother was there, and her eyes were kind, and her smile was the one she saved for him, and his father was there, and his shoulders were broad and strong, and the way they looked when Kale rode on them, and they were all there, and every human who had ever lived was there. Their DNA and their memories and their dreams and their laughter and their tears and everything they were, and everything they could have been was stored inside the first light, pressed into its dimensional energy like flowers pressed between the pages of an infinite book. The architects had designed this, and it was the first light's final gift, and it was the gift it was meant to deliver when the time was right. And the time was right, because a boy was breaking under the weight of being the last, and the first light would not let him break. Kale did not carry the memory of humanity. He carried humanity itself. He fell to his knees and he wept, and the weeping was not sad, and it was the kind of crying that happens when something you thought was lost forever turns out to have been waiting for you all along. Chiton speaker Cora came to him the next day, and she said, "The new council would like to offer you a gift, and the gift is a world, and you may choose any uninhabited planet in the galaxy." Kale thought about this for a long time, and then he said, "I want a world with oceans and mountains and green things growing, and I want it to be in a quiet system where nobody will bother us." Cora clicked in amusement and said, "I think we can manage that." They found a world in a system with a gentle yellow star, and the planet had blue oceans and green continents, and white clouds and mountains that touched the sky, and it looked like Earth the way Earth looked in the pictures Kale's mother had shown him. He named it Lena. The ship that carried him to the surface was a Velathi trading vessel because the Velathi had insisted, and because Kale trusted them, and because the larvae would not stop crying until they were told they could come along for the ride. Kale stepped onto the soil of his new world, and it was warm beneath his feet, and the air smelled like rain and growing things, and the wind moved through the grass, and it sounded like breathing. He stood there for a long time, and Luma hummed around him, and the hum was different now, and it was not a lullaby, and it was not a shield, and it was a beginning. Kale closed his eyes, and he reached inside himself to the place where the light was, and where 11 billion people waited, and he felt them stir the way seeds stir in spring, when the first warmth reaches them through the soil. He opened his eyes and looked up. The sky filled with light. 11 billion points of light appeared, and they were not stars, and they were not ships, and they were something else entirely, and each one was a life, and each one was a person, and each one was a human being held in perfect preservation by a force that had loved them before they were born. The lights descended like seeds falling from a tree, and they sank into the earth, and the ground glowed where they touched it, and the warmth spread beneath the surface, and the soil hummed, and the oceans shimmered, and the mountains resonated with a frequency that sounded like a heartbeat. Kale knelt and pressed both hands into the soil, and it was warm and alive, and he could feel them down there stirring and reaching and waking up. "Wake up," he whispered, "we have so much to do." The ground pulsed, and the first blades of new grass pushed through the soil around his fingers, and somewhere deep beneath the surface, something moved, and it was not geological, and it was not chemical, and it was human. On Axiom Prime Chiton speaker, Cora received the energy readings from the planet Lena, and she looked at them for a long time, and then she called an emergency session of the new council, and she stood before 4,000 species, and she said, "Let the record show what happened today." The chamber was silent. They tried to erase humanity, and they failed, and not because humans were strong, and not because humans were powerful, and not because humans had a cosmic guardian watching over them, although they did. She paused and clicked softly. They failed because one boy, the smallest and weakest of all of them, was given the choice between vengeance and mercy, and he chose mercy, and he chose it without hesitation, and he chose it because his mother told him to be better and he listened. She looked around the chamber. And that is why the first light chose them. And that is why the architects built a guardian that waited 4 billion years for a species that would choose kindness when cruelty was easier. And we tried to erase that from the universe, and the universe said no. The chamber was still silent, and it would remain silent for a long time, because there was nothing to say that had not already been said by a 10-year-old boy kneeling in the dirt of a new world with his hands in the soil and tears on his face, and a smile so wide it could have held the whole galaxy inside it. On the planet Lena, the sun set for the first time, and the sky turned gold, and then pink, and then deep purple, and the stars came out one by one, and Kale sat on a hill overlooking an ocean, and Luma wrapped around him like a warm wind, and the ground beneath him hummed with 11 billion sleeping hearts. And Kale, the last human who was not the last human anymore, looked out at the ocean his mother had told him about, and he watched the waves, and he listened to the wind, and he felt the warmth of the soil, and he said to no one and to everyone, "We are still here." And somewhere in the earth beneath his feet, 11 billion voices answered. And the answer was yes. And the answer was always. And the answer was just the beginning.